Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for tonight's lecture. My name is Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies here at Virginia Tech, which is sponsoring tonight's event. Our mission is to provide educational opportunities in Civil War era history for students here at Virginia Tech, of course, but also to K through 12 students and K through 12 teachers and to the general public as well. And we're able to offer all of these opportunities thanks to the generosity of our donors who share our belief that understanding the Civil War era is more important now than ever before and deserves to be supported. So I encourage you to check out our website, civilwar.vt.edu. Of course, you can also find us on social media, Facebook and YouTube and other platforms. We're beginning to wind things down here for the academic year. We've got a couple of quiet months over the summer, but we're already making plans for next academic year. We've got some really exciting programs to look forward to then. But first, tonight, we have a very special speaker, Michael Vorenberg, who is a professor of history at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And he's the author of Final Freedom, the Civil War, the Abolition of Slavery, and the 13th Amendment, which was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize and was also a key source for Steven Spielberg's 2012 film, Lincoln. If you haven't seen the film yet, I would highly recommend it. And also read Dr. Vorenberg's book as well to get the full picture. He's also the author of a book called The Emancipation Proclamation, A Brief History with Documents, as well as a number of essays on slavery, emancipation, and the US Constitution. His writings have also appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, Politico, and the Washington Post. And his latest book just came out last month. It is Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. It's only been out a few weeks, but it's already garnering the accolades. It's already been named one of the top 10 books to read in 2025 by the Los Angeles Times. And of course, that's the subject area that he's going to share with us tonight. He will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion with the audience at the end. And discussion will take place using the Q&A function in Zoom. So audience members won't be able to turn on their microphones or cameras, but they can at any time type their questions and comments into the Q&A box in the Zoom interface. And we will answer as many of your questions as we possibly can before wrapping things up around 8:15 Eastern Time. So I want to thank you all very much for joining us tonight, for taking time out of your evening to share this experience and to learn from Dr. Vorenberg. I especially want to thank Dr. Vorenberg for being with us and sharing his expertise this evening. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Paul, and thank you to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. Greetings to everyone who's here. Thank you for taking time out. It's a beautiful spring evening here in the East, and I suspect many of you might prefer to be outside, but you're inside listening to me, and I appreciate that. I'm Michael Vorenberg, and as Paul mentioned, about a month ago, I published a new book, which is called Lincoln's Peace, and it's on the shelf behind me, but now I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to speak, as Paul said, for about 30 minutes, and what I'm going to do is take us through this book, and in a very kind of hasty way, but I want to make sure to leave time for questions. And as you see on the cover, this is, in a way, the actual beginning of the book. The book asks us to think about when the Civil War ended. And of course, one of the comments I've often received while writing the book and then in these past weeks as I've spoken about it has the war ended, or are we on the verge of another war? But in this book, I really am tackling the war itself and the question of this specific war of the 1860s. When did it end? And it turns out that that question is quite a bit complicated. But more important, the complexity reveals themes and subjects that are, at least to me, terribly important. As I argue in the book, the point at which we choose to call the Civil War over, that point, in effect, defines the war for us. And I'll say more about that argument later on. The cover image I'll come to momentarily, but it's an image of Lincoln, and that's Grant to his right, and there are others in the image as well that are cut off on the book. The image is from City Point, Virginia, Grant's headquarters in the east, and we are on the River Queen, a boat that has traveled from Washington. And the book begins after the prologue with Lincoln taking this trip from the White House to City Point on this boat, which becomes his traveling office. And I believe that when he left the White House on March 27th, 1865, he expected not to return until he had seen the end of the war, and even orchestrated, if he could, the peace to follow, or at least to set the template by which peace would be created. The trip he took from the White House to City Point, as you see here, this trip he had taken before, or similar trips like it, but all those trips had been relatively short, 2 or 3 days. He had never left the White House for more than a few days at a time. It was very rare for a president to leave the White House for a long time. But in this case, he had a mission, I believe, and that was to orchestrate or to see at least the end of the war. And he would end up being away from the White House for about 2 weeks, a really long time for him. And I think that says a lot about what he was seeking to do and what he hoped to do. So this is the trip he would make. And on March 28th, 1865, this is the full painting known as called The Peacemakers by George Healy, painted in 1868, that depicts the meeting of March 28th on the River Queen, the ship that Lincoln was using as his office. And we see Grant, of course, and we see on the far left Sherman, and then David Dixon Porter, the admiral, on the right. So these are his top commanders of the East, Grant, although Grant is also the commander of all armies, Sherman of the West, and Dixon of the seas, I guess, in the East anyway. And the book spends a little time on this meeting. I'll come back to it later on if there are questions. But it's during this meeting that Lincoln discusses with his commanders the terms of surrender that he hopes that they will dictate to the Confederates if and when surrender is to come. That's one of the subjects, the main subject. And Lincoln's discussion of these terms includes his phrase, let them up easy, or let them up easy, which is a very well-known sort of sentiment, which is generosity and the absence of malice toward the enemy. Earlier that month, he had given his second inaugural, which included the statement, with malice toward none. Here he expresses the sentiment in the terms of a wrestler, let him up easy. He himself had been a wrestler. And the idea of let him up easy was to be kind to your enemy, and in so doing, to foment, to create a peace that will last, as your enemy will honor you for having been kind, even as the enemy admits defeat. So goes that phrase. Roughly 10 days from this meeting, or closer really to 2 weeks, you have the surrender at Appomattox. This is, for I think most Americans, the endpoint of the Civil War. Lincoln wasn't there at Appomattox. He had stayed long enough to see Richmond fall on April 3rd. He had visited Richmond. He had also toured Petersburg. But circumstances forced him to return to Washington, and he landed back in Washington on April 9th and learned on that day, or that evening, that Robert E. Lee had surrendered. This image before you is one of many images of the surrender. This happens to have been painted by Tom Lovell on the centennial of the surrender, so it's from 1965. And I won't spend much time on this image, but just to make the point that some version of this image, this picture of Appomattox, I believe is ingrained in the minds of many Americans, whether they saw it in a textbook they read as a young person, maybe they saw the actual painting, maybe they saw the scene depicting Grant departing the Wilmer McLean house that was in Spielberg's film Lincoln from 2012. So this moment, April 9, 1865, of surrender, but it's a surrender on equal terms of sorts. Both men looking at the same level. Lee is pictured as very respectable. And that's really important to the idea of the Appomattox surrender. A neat ending of the war, a clean ending, an ending agreed to by both sides. That ending, in effect, defines the war in a certain kind of way. A peaceful ending, an honorable ending. In my book, in talking about other endings that follow this ending, illustrate how when you look at other endings, those endings then offer different ways of thinking about the war than perhaps such a neat, peaceful, and honorable ending. In fact, if we just take it to the next day, April 10, 1865, that's a day that actually gets very little attention, but both Lee and Grant remained at Appomattox that day. And Grant tells us in his memoirs of what happened. He rode out from the US troops from their lines and met with Lee on horseback, and the two sat on horseback and had a discussion. No one really was within earshot, although someone claimed to be. And so we have to trust Grant's own account of what happened. Lee never gave an account of what happened. But Grant, his purpose in this meeting and what he said to Lee to start things off was to ask Lee if Lee would contact President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy and ask Davis to surrender the whole Confederacy. And in doing so, that would truly end the war. Grant said that Lee was the most respected man of the South and of the Confederacy, and certainly his voice would make a difference in this plea to Davis. Lee refuses to contact Davis. Davis, by the way, has left Richmond after Richmond fell and is with the Confederate cabinet on a train in the interior of Virginia, headed towards North Carolina. And so Lee refuses, and that's interesting in itself, in that, well, that tells us that both of these generals understand that, in a technical way at least, the Confederacy still lives because the president of the Confederacy is still active. Lee then said to Grant, I suspect it may take your army 3 or 4 times marching across the country before you have put the fighting to an end. Now, that's a very different kind of sentiment than what happened or what's conveyed in the image from the day before. That's a sentiment of an ongoing war, not necessarily a war of organized armies, and it certainly wasn't going to be a war of organized armies, and I think both men understood this. There was still an organized army in North Carolina under Joe Johnston, but that would surrender by the end of April. And then there were about 50,000 Confederates west of the Mississippi, not very well organized. But what Lee had in mind when he said this, of course, were unorganized armies, individual troops, other hostile forces to the United States, guerrillas, and that it may take the US Army a long time to put this down. So there we are on the day after the Great Surrender, acknowledging what might still be to come. And to me, that's tells us right away what's coming potentially, and then what we know will come. For more than a year, actual warfare continues. And by that I mean the Congress is saying that the country is at war. The president, who is Andrew Johnson after Lincoln is assassinated, acknowledges that the country's at a state of war and that the war powers still can be used and are being used to keep the US Army in the South and in the West. There's still operations to deal with guerrillas. There's still operations to deal with hostiles who are Confederates, but also hostiles who are Native Americans, who are hostile to the US. There's a potential hostile force across the Rio Grande in Mexico. And these are Napoleon's troops, the French army, who are serving to support Emperor Maximilian in Mexico. All of these theaters of war are active after these discussions at Appomattox. So in dealing with this book, I realized that not only did I have to deal with the when of the Civil War, that is, when did it end, but also the where of the Civil War, because of course it extends far west and south of Appomattox, well into the West, and of course involves not just organized armies, but unorganized troops and guerrillas. These questions, by the way, I should mention, of the when and the where, have been of long interest to historians. I'm not the first one here. And in recent years, especially, the where of the war was the Native American, were the Native American conflicts in the West part of the Civil War? That's been a subject of some really interesting discussion among historians. What about the guerrilla war? Was the guerrilla war, or the continuing guerrilla fighting, I should say, beyond Appomattox, does that count as part of the Civil War or not? Again, recent discussions about this issue of historians. So in order to write this book, I had to engage with this really fascinating literature and other literatures as well. And it really was an enjoyable experience, and I learned a great deal in the process. So when then was the Civil War over? Well, let me just take us from here ahead a little bit more than a year to the legal end, a legal end. And I'll emphasize that many times. So for a number of reasons, when we get to the middle of 1866, the President Andrew Johnson wants war, the state of war, to be over. And this has to do with his battle with Congress. And Congress wants to hold on to war powers to keep Reconstruction going, and so they can use the Army in Reconstruction, and so they can use the Army in the West and other places. So they want war powers. Johnson wants the war to be over, completely over, so that the country can move on. And he wants Reconstruction to be hasty. Basically, he wants Reconstruction to be over as well. On August 20th, 1866, Johnson issues this proclamation. It's a follow-up proclamation from one he had issued in April of the same year, but this one is more complete. This one declares that the said insurrection, that is the war, is at an end, and he's speaking everywhere in the country, and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist throughout the whole of the US. Opponents of Johnson, and by this time there are many, ridiculed the idea that the war was over. They pointed out that only the month before there had been a massacre in New Orleans, at the time often called the New Orleans riots, and a couple months before that, the riots in Memphis. But even outside of those massacres that were racial in nature, there continued to be real violence in Texas and in the West, and of course, hostilities farther to the west, in the Southwest and on the plains with Native Americans. So people did ridicule this at the time, but one of my early discoveries was that this date is actually the legal end of the war. The Supreme Court affirmed that this is the end of the war. And it struck me at the time when I learned that fact as a fascinating idea that a president, simply by declaration, could end a war. Of course, we know better that this doesn't actually happen by declaration, but technically, legally, it can happen, and it does happen. It happened here. It has happened in other wars, which I can talk about if you wish during the question period. But this becomes the end. And so if you think about it, then we are left with a timeline that is a long timeline, which is sort of the beginning of the end to a kind of end of the end, the proclamation. Now, I can fill in this timeline, and I do in the book, with various events about that ask us to think about how do we think about when a war is over? What is the event or the episode that we expect to happen for the war to be over? For example, how about the last battle? Maybe that's a good way to sort of figure out the war is over, when the last battle is fought. Well, when was the last battle? And I just give this as an example because even on a question like this, which seems fairly straightforward, there's complexity. There are two different places in the United States that claim to be the site of the last battle. They are Columbus, Georgia, on the western border of Georgia, and Palmito Ranch, Texas. That battle happens almost a month after the Battle of Columbus. And that's happening on the border, the Palmito Ranch, with Texas. It's a much smaller battle, skirmishes really over 2 days. Each site has a plaque that commemorates the last battle of the Civil War. On the left, the plaque from Columbus, which claims that it was the last important land battle. So that's its way around this thorny problem of Palmito Ranch. And then on the right, the plaque that stands at one of the engagements at Palmito Ranch. So when does the war end? Maybe with the last battle. So maybe we would say mid-April, maybe mid-May. But is that a satisfactory way to think about the end? Because after all, even after these last battles, there are still armies in the field that are hostile to the US. So maybe the better way to think about the end might be the last surrender. When does the last army that's hostile to the US surrender? It certainly isn't at Appomattox. After Appomattox, we get major surrenders in North Carolina, Joe Johnston to Sherman. We have the last surrender of a theater of war, really, which is the Trans-Mississippi Theater. On June 2nd, 1865, if you look to the left of this map, you'll see the surrender of Edmund Kirby Smith in the port of Galveston. Although, interestingly enough, Kirby Smith himself did not show up to the surrender. His lieutenant showed up and signed the agreement. But Kirby Smith himself was worried that he would be arrested on site, tried, probably executed as a traitor. And so what he does is he makes his way to Mexico, and on the way he finds others sympathetic to the cause of the Confederacy, the so-called Confederados, who are on their way with Joe Shelby in command of the Iron Brigade. Anyway, that's a whole nother story of these Confederates who cross the Rio Grande, end up in Mexico. What happens to them? Some of them think that they can make an alliance with Napoleon's troops and create an army that can keep the war going once they cross back over the Rio Grande into Texas. Anyway, I mentioned that just to say that even the last surrender of a major general like Kirby Smith leaves us hanging with the possibility of more war to come. But even after Kirby Smith surrenders, there are still generals in the field who just don't abide by Kirby Smith's orders to surrender. And the most famous of these, and I would argue truly the last Confederate general to surrender, as many of you will know, is Stand Watie or Wattie, who surrenders in Dokesville in Creek Territory, present-day Oklahoma, on June 23rd, 1865. The surrender depicted here is a modern rendering by the artist Dennis Parker of Wetey's surrender. And he was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He was also a chief of the Cherokee. He proclaimed himself, and his followers proclaimed him to be the genuine chief of all Cherokee. But his rival, John Ross, proclaimed himself to be the chief and was the recognized chief later on by the US government. So by introducing Stan Wetey, I've introduced Native Americans into the picture, but they've been in the picture all along. This particular Native American, the Cherokee leader, Stan Wetey, also happens to be a Confederate. And so he is surrendering actually in two capacities, as a general of the Confederacy and as the leader, self-proclaimed, of the Cherokee. To his west and northwest, there are many other Native tribes who have been at war with the US during this conflict, who do not surrender, and who the US government is very interested in getting to surrender. So that's a part of the story, too, that I try to tell in this book. There's another complexity to surrender, and that is I'm only talking about land surrenders. There's a ship still at sea, a Confederate ship in the Pacific during the whole summer of 1865, and that's the Shenandoah. The Shenandoah has its own complicated story, acquired from England, eventually sailing around the globe. Its mission to destroy the whaling fleets of New England that are operating in the Northern Pacific, it successfully does that mission, setting fire to or sinking many of those ships in June and July of 1865. This is weeks, months after this time when we think of the war ending. And in a single week, the Shenandoah does more economic destruction to Union goods because of the value of whale oil than is done in any other week of the war to the Union to goods or property. So the Shenandoah does a tremendous amount of damage, and then it has to surrender, but it doesn't know where to surrender, because once it learns that the war is over, and it doesn't learn this until really early August, it has to figure out where to surrender because it knows that they could be arrested as pirates because so much of their depredations have happened after formal armies have surrendered. And so they're very worried about that. So they end up surrendering in Liverpool, England. And there's even a plaque there in Liverpool to mark that surrender. So we have these various ways of thinking about the end of the war. And I just present them to you just to show how complicated it is to find an endpoint of the war, and how, even if we take these sort of classic definitions of an ending, it's harder to find than we might think. If we fill in our timeline with all the events between Appomattox and that August 20th Proclamation 1866 by Johnson, President Johnson, we're chock full of events that I've displayed here. But all I've really shown is a series of classic military events, battles, surrenders, military proclamations. But think about how that timeline then gets even more complicated and how we tell a different story. If we do now add in the story of Native Americans in the West and the Southwest and the Great Plains and what's going on there. So if we now look at those events, and I will not have the time here to take us through each of them, but we put those front and center, as I do in a couple chapters of the book that are separated by a few other chapters. And we think about the surrender of Stan Wetey on June 23rd, 1865 as one event, but then events keep going. They involve other tribes, other peoples, the Navajo on the Bosque Redondo in the Southwest, who are trying to break out from effectively an incarceral type of system that's been set up by General James Carleton. And then meanwhile, in the plains, we have the Sioux and the other great tribes of the Great Plains who remain a serious threat to civilians and army alike. And so the army sends the Powder River expedition in the summer and fall of 1865. It will not be until mid 1866 that you get the treaties with the so-called civilized tribes, the Cherokee Creek and others. And then 2 years after that, still, before there's anything like a treaty with the Navajo in the Southwest. And the treaty system itself is in jeopardy and will end up being abolished within a few years after all of these events. So what then does a treaty really mean if a treaty ends a war? Finally, the timeline looks different yet again. If we ask ourselves, what is the objective of the war for the United States? And really, if we think about it, the end of a war is when the objective is attained. The objective, of course, is the reunion of the country, bringing the states of the South back into the Union. That certainly was the stated objective at the beginning of the war. But of course, the objective has changed by 1865 and changed drastically, so that destroying slavery is an objective of the war. It had always really been an objective of the war for many people, and certainly the enslaved people themselves had seen that as the deeper cause of the war. But in 1865, it is the stated objective. It has been the stated objective since the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. It has been one of the central topics of debate during the election of 1864 in the North. That is, must slavery be abolished for the South to be accepted back in? And it's the stated objective in Lincoln's second inaugural, when Lincoln says that slavery is the cause of the war, and if the war must go on until slavery is destroyed, so be it. And it's very clear. So what if we then ask ourselves, well, when is that objective, the destruction of slavery, attained? What if we add to this timeline emancipation? After all, that being the cause of the war, not just a kind of moral cause, but actually the military objective. And now the dates begin to look slightly different. We look maybe at May 1st, Decoration Day, which, as David Blight and others have written about, when African Americans in Charleston decorate the graves of the dead and acknowledging the place of slavery and emancipation in the war. Or Juneteenth, June 19th, a day marked by an order given by the general in Galveston that declares slavery over in Texas and declares absolute equality between the races. A pledge that general never delivered on. And yet Juneteenth does become so crucial to African American memory in the South, in Texas, and then eventually everywhere, eventually becoming a national holiday a few years ago. Or do we select December 18th, the day that the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, proclaims that the 13th Amendment is now part of the Constitution, the amendment that abolished slavery? That would be a reasonable end of war date because legally slavery is now over. But of course, ending slavery, in fact, as opposed to by amendment, requires work, law, occupation by Union troops. And so really it's going to take the Civil Rights Act, the Second Freedmen's Bureau Act, both of which have to be passed over Johnson's veto. It'll take more amendments to the Constitution, as you see at the end of the timeline. Finding the end of slavery, I would argue, is a harder task than finding the end of the war. And yet, shouldn't these two things line up somehow if the war is about the end of slavery? And for me, that is probably the most important question looming over my head as I wrote the book and looms over my head still. How do we think about this war that is a war to end slavery? If we accept that, then how do we think about the end date? And what do we do then if we celebrate Appomattox as the ending, which often we still do? And it is an ending. I don't mean to demean Appomattox. It is a terrifically important moment. The surrender is announced to the press, by the press, as the end of the war. Soldiers take it as the end of the war. Civilians take it as the end of the war. African Americans claim it also as the end of the war and as the end of slavery in Virginia and elsewhere. That's something Elizabeth Barron writes about so well in her book on Appomattox. So I don't mean to say that Appomattox is a non-ending. It is absolutely an ending, but it's not a complete ending by any means, certainly not when we add into this story, the story of Black freedom. And if we then think about the story of Black freedom and how that story might be told and is told in images or words, if we go to Galveston and we look at the mural titled Absolute Equality that was painted by Reginald Adams and a team of artists, that puts at center, of course, Lincoln, but also the order declaring absolute equality by General Granger. And then acknowledges that there's still events to come. The images you see on the right of the mural actually have been painted over and new images added. So this is a mural that tells a different story, a longer story. On the left, Harriet Tubman, then to Lincoln, and then to Juneteenth, and then beyond to, I guess, the present and future. So that's a very different way of thinking about time and endings. If there is to be a peace, after all, what kind of peace are we talking about? And is Appomattox enough of a peace? Lincoln, in what turned out to be his last speech, talked about his wish for a speedy and righteous peace. The speedy peace, I guess, we got in Appomattox, and Lincoln did congratulate General Grant and the troops at Appomattox for the surrender there. But if you read Lincoln's last speech, you'll see he never says that the war is over, not there or anywhere else. He knows that the war is coming to a close, to be sure, but he knows that for there to be a righteous peace, more has to happen. And so, what is the moment of that righteous peace? Is it Appomattox? Probably not. Is it the proclamation of Andrew Johnson, August 20th, 1866? That's hardly a proclamation about righteous peace. That's a proclamation saying the insurrection is at an end by a president firmly committed to white supremacy. So we are left to ponder when the Civil Wars, not so much as a puzzle, although it is a puzzle, but as a question that is historical and ethical in its nature. And I would argue as the best history should be ethical in its considerations. Where then are we today in the quest for Lincoln's righteous peace? So I'll stop there and happily take questions and look forward to your questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I can almost hear the virtual applause reverberating around the country. Yeah, really fascinating talk. We already have some very interesting questions that have been submitted, but I encourage everyone to continue typing your questions in to the Q&A box. And the first one I really like because it picks up on the image that's on the cover of the book, which you mentioned, the Peacemaker's image. And the question is, why did the artist include this rainbow behind Lincoln's shoulder? Symbolism or an accurate reflection of the scene?
I'm going to share my screen again. Bear with me. There's the full painting. And yes, so now with the full painting, you can see the rainbow over Lincoln's left shoulder and head. I believe that, and it's a great question, and I do think that rainbow, it's in the center. You can't miss it. I hope you can't miss it. Of course, in a painting like this, and most paintings, you can't have dialogue. So we have to imagine what's being said. For people viewing this painting, they might not know what event is being depicted, but they'll see Lincoln. They'll know that these are top commanders. They'll guess that. So what's the dialogue? Well, in a sense, the rainbow is the dialogue. The rainbow is the notion of a peace, of an ending, of these are all military people, although Lincoln, of course, is not dressed in military garb, and they're talking about war. And yet, peace is in the room in the shape or the vision, I guess, of the rainbow. So I think that's what the author had in mind. And after all, the title is The Peacemakers. And so that title is important to the painter. And this painting, I should say, has its own history that I tell in the epilogue of the book. And I won't go too much on at length, but I'll just say that it ends up at the White House in 1947 and hangs in the White House in the treaty room for most of its years there, which is appropriate, of course. If the treaty room is a place where peace is made, treaties are signed, then this is where it should be. And so that's a living kind of memory of peace that goes on in the White House, although the painting is eventually removed from that spot. And it's still in the White House. Where it is, well, I guess we don't really know, but its history after the treaty room I say a little bit about in the book, but I won't say more now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating painting. And one of the points you made was about the importance of the title of the painting, which leads nicely on to another question. One viewer thanks you for the presentation and wonders how terminology influences how we think about the Civil War. There seem to be some recent academic trends considering KKK and White League violence as a continuation of the war into the late 60s. If one were to rename the conflict as the War of the Rebellion, what does that imply? Does it mean that the war ends when Johnston declares it over in April 1866?
It's a great question. And I do think, again, one of both the challenges and rewards of writing this book was getting to engage with some of the, I guess, hot topics in Civil War history, one of which is this question of let us approach this violence head on and really confront it and ask, are these just sort of random events, or is this in fact a continuation of the war? And that is a reasonable and great question. My take on this is that if one wants to call it a continuation of the war, I think that's fine. I certainly do describe the KKK and these sorts of actions. And of course, I mentioned the massacres in Memphis and New Orleans. But the KKK action, of course, is most of that is later in the 1860s and includes spectacular trials and in South Carolina. That goes on into 1870. And of course, the KKK then continues very strongly into the 1870s. And in the epilogue, I talk about some of the events of the 1870s and whether they count as the end of war. Certainly, they have been written about as such by historians. For me, though, I'm a little reluctant to go there to see a perfect continuity, And the reason is that the objective of the insurrection was to create a Confederate nation and to have that nation recognized by the United States and all nations. That objective never left President Davis and the organized armies of the Confederacy. Even when there were these sort of fantasies of restarting the war, that again was the objective, is if you could hold out long enough. You don't have to win, you just have to not lose. If you could just have the armies hold out long enough and wear down Northern morale, maybe they'd just give that Southern nation its nation status. The type of warfare that the Klan is engaged in, or other paramilitary white groups against Black Southerners and against certain white Unionists in the South as well, these actions are serious, they are bloody, they are violent. But are they aimed at securing for the white South, white Southerners, a distinct and separate nation? I think not. I think their objective, there are many objectives. They're much more targeted around politics. They are violence for the sake of violence. Of course, they're energized and impelled by racism. But the idea of a political or legal or I guess continental objective in terms of a separate Southern nation, I think that falls away. Maybe that doesn't matter, but to me, it does in a way, because I think what we're really dealing with here and what I call these events are insurgencies. Now, insurgency is a modern word, and in many ways, my book is informed by the 21st century US invasions in the Middle East and the insurgencies that follow. These are insurgencies. They are insurgencies, many of them led by former Confederates. But as insurgencies, the objectives are to harass and create hostilities of the Union troops, and of course, harass and to kill civilians. And that's significant, but maybe not coherent in a political fashion, except to say, to get the only coherent function here, if there is any coherent function, would be to get the army out of the South. And to that extent, of course, they succeed. But that function is but one of many. So I'm not answering the question as well as I might. I did have myself and a research assistant look at the way that these events are reported in the press, these insurgencies, whether they're KKK violence and other sorts of violence, and to say, at the time, are people calling these a continuation of the Civil War or a continuation of the rebellion, the insurrection? And it's actually very rare to find people commenting on that. Now, that could be because people just want the war to be over, the writers of the newspaper articles. That's certainly true. But I do think something should be taken away from that this is something different than the organized war before. But I don't mean to take away just how significant it is.
Yeah, definitely a good distinction there, I think. We have another viewer who also congratulates you on your book and a fine talk, and who is interested in when an ordinary American would have felt like the war was over, and really what did that feel like for ordinary Americans?
Yes. Well, I guess you'd have to say whether the American is residing in the North or South, right? That might make a great difference, whether the American is a white person or a black person, or let's say, or maybe a Native American. That these things matter a great deal, as would be probably obvious even without reading my book. So I think for actually Northern and Southern whites alike, the notion of the war being over with the surrender at Appomattox and certainly the surrender of Johnston, North Carolina, that that would be the common way of thinking of it at the time. And when the surrender at Appomattox is reported across the North, the common headline is the end. And if you look at diaries of people, North and South, once they hear the news of Lee's surrender, and before that, the fall of Richmond, they often put the war is over. Absolutely. But here's the funny thing. I ran into many accounts, and I think other historians have seen this too, if they've looked at the records, where the same newspaper, or the same person writing a diary, then goes on, having said the end, then goes on to report events that clearly indicate that the person thinks that something's going on that looks like the war. So I remember seeing a diary that sort of then keeps on telling of events that they're hearing about. This is a Northern diary, actually, that talks about, well, there's this surrender, then there's this surrender. And then May 10th is when they get word, well, it's when Jefferson Davis is captured in Georgia. And then he reports news of Jefferson Davis's capture, and then this diarist writes, the end. So that's the end then. So it's hard to know, but I say this because the ordinary Northerner absolutely would say Appomattox, and the Southerner, the white Southerner also. The fall of Richmond or Appomattox certainly would see as the South. In the West, and by the West I include Texas, those are different people. They really, first of all, it takes a long time before they hear about the surrenders in the East. That's important. So they're certainly not talking about the end of the war. They won't hear about the surrenders. Even when they hear about them, they don't believe them. But in Galveston, the paper there, the Confederate newspaper, says the war's not over. Davis himself, after Appomattox, says, hey, the Confederate Army is stronger than ever before because now we don't have to defend these cities, so we're a great big army. But yes, there are these ways in which people have already said the war is over, and yet those same people then have to confront the realities of these other events, and so they begin to reconsider when the war is over. And to me, that's what's interesting, is that the average American says the war is over. Look, I don't begin the book, but I do tell the story of how the kernel of this idea came really. I didn't really start writing the book till 2013 or so, or researching it. But in 2003 is when you get George W. Bush, President George W. Bush, on a US ship saying mission, well, he doesn't say mission accomplished, but that banner is behind him. It becomes known as the mission accomplished speech. And it's this notion of the war is over in Iraq. That marks for Bush at that moment the end of the war and the beginning of something else, what he calls a war of occupation. And actually, legally, that is the end of the war as it's marked by political scientists who work on these kinds of things. I think, did Americans at that moment, the day after Bush's speech, say the war in Iraq is over? I think many did say that the war is over in terms of we've won, now something new begins. But of course, war in Iraq continued for 8 years and in Afghanistan for more than that. So this way of being able to have two ideas at once, war is over, and yet something like war continues. We're quite used to this in the 21st century. I'd say we're used to this for years in the 20th century. So in a sense, Americans of this era, the 1865-66 period, they're experiencing this also. We just don't think of them experiencing this in this way. So yes, the war is over, but some of these people may then have a rude awakening when they find out, for example, I'll just give this last story. When soldiers hear that the war is over, many of them, US soldiers, go home. They think the war is over. And some of those soldiers are arrested for desertion. And these include many Black soldiers who are arrested for desertion. And their response naturally is, I don't understand. I've heard that Richmond has fallen and Lee has surrendered. And furthermore, they've seen a headline, let's say, that says the end. So they're on perfectly reasonable ground until their commander says, hey, you signed up for 3 years or the end of the war. And guess what? The end of the war has not arrived. And so it's a very rude awakening to be arrested for desertion in this moment. So it's very real that the consequences of these endpoints for various reasons are very significant. They're not just sort of me as a historian sort of having fun here. They are very significant on the ground. And I just give that one example of desertion, but they're very significant on the ground too in terms of, is there going to be a US Army presence to protect people from organizations like the Klan?
Yeah, I also really enjoyed in the book the example you gave about the applicant for a Civil War pension. Um, and I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that because it's such a fascinating kind of example as well.
Yes, the story of how I came to write this book has a couple pieces to it. One is that, yeah, the notion of Bush giving the speech was in my head, the mission accomplished speech. It happened to be it was just a couple days after that I was going through the archives and working on a different project. And basically I was at the National Archives and the wrong box came, and this happens sometimes. So while I waited for the correct box to come, I went through the box that before me, and it turned out to be a box with a massive set of notes in it called End of Civil War. And these were all notes and files and big report, all done by this Assistant Secretary of War in roughly about 1890, who had been given the task of finding the actual true end date of the Civil War. And and I thought this was fascinating, and it was like his research project for a long time. Now, why had he been given this task? And now we come to what you just said about the pension application. There had been a number of pension applications filed by people who were asking for wartime pensions, who had signed up to fight and or who had served in a period well after Appomattox. The pension case reviewer then quite naturally said, well, this is a crazy application because they don't really even become a member of the service until after we know the war is over. And so how could this application be real? Now, the person who in 1890 was trying to figure out the answer to what do we do with these pension applications. He himself, his name actually is Grant. He's no relation to Ulysses Grant. His name is Lewis Grant. He had been an officer at Appomattox during the surrender. He was there. He knew the end, right? But here he is uncovering all these events like I described, these battles, these surrenders that happen after, the presence of the US Army. And he includes US forces fighting Native Americans in the West. And he also then talks about the Andrew Johnson Proclamation. And he learns that the Supreme Court affirmed that date as the end. So he ends up choosing, he is a lawyer also, I should say, and that matters. So as a lawyer, he's looking for a legal, something they can use as a legal end. So he ends up using August 20th, 1866. All, all because of a relatively simple, really mundane thing, a pension application, right? And so, yeah, it could be a pension application. It could be a soldier at the time who says, I want to go home and I deserve to go home because the war is over. Here are my enlistment papers that say that my term ends when the war is over. And so the war is over. So that's an enlistment paper is a very mundane document, right? But these are things have huge consequence. And then if you say to the enslaved person who says, I'm a free person, and yet my master is saying I'm not. And this dialogue is going on in Texas in 1865. It's going on in Kentucky. These are conversations that are happening. The consequences of these conversations hinge on whether the war is over or not. And if the war is over, does that mean, of course, that slavery is also as well? The consequences could not be more important in terms of what's going on here. So some are mundane, a pension application and enlistment paper, but some, of course, are hugely important in terms of African Americans absolutely with good reason believing they're free, having these kinds of conversations with people who say that they're not.
Yeah, there are so many fascinating strands to this question. Simple question it seems like, but so many different approaches you need to take to answer it properly. And one additional strand that hasn't come up so far is a group of people who had a different take on the whether the Civil War should end and how, and that's the Lincoln conspirators. So do you have any information about their perspective on this question? Did they reasonably think that the war should and could continue if they were successful in assassinating Lincoln?
Yes, I mean, I think the assassins certainly thought. Also, let us remember. So first of all, there's well, there's many assassins. How many? I guess it will always be a debate. But certainly, their objective is not only to kill Lincoln, but also to kill Seward, Johnson, perhaps others. And of course, they succeed with Lincoln. They nearly succeed with Seward. Their objective definitely is to strike a blow against morale in the North, and ideally, somehow there's all sorts of fantasies circulating. A lot of it's just rage, but a lot of it is a fantasy of keeping the war going. I mean, the first plot isn't to kill Lincoln, but to kidnap him, and to kidnap him and hold him as ransom, if you will, until the Union government acknowledges the Confederate government. That plan obviously gives way to an assassination plan. But that plan, the kidnapping plan, could not be clear about, yeah, they really think in their minds that this will help the war cause. I should also mention that when Lincoln is assassinated, of course, we know now a lot more than they knew then about who was behind it all. But many in the North assume that this is a Confederate plot, that this is a Confederate government sanctioned plot, or at the very least, the Confederate knew about the plot and didn't stop it. And so many treat this as an act of war that's gone on, and it takes a while to tease all the facts out. And so that's one answer to your question. But another kind of answer then, when those conspirators are tried, Wilkes Booth, of course, is killed during the manhunt. But if many conspirators are tried and four eventually hanged, one of their key points of defense is because they are tried by a military tribunal, is that the trial itself is unconstitutional. Because how can you have a military tribunal if the war is over? And that's a really good question. It's a question I explore more in depth in my book by looking at the trial that follows, which is the trial of Henry Wirz that comes after the trial of the assassins. Henry Wirz is the commandant of Andersonville Prison in Georgia, definitely the most infamous POW camp of the war. And after the war, he's arrested and he is tried in Washington. And that trial is a sensational trial. And then, of course, as many of you know, he is convicted and he is hanged. And the hanging, there's a photograph of the hanging. There's a couple photographs that are quite famous. That trial is a really important set of circumstances for me because Another way we might mark the end of any war is the trial and sentencing of the perpetrators. And yet such a trial doesn't happen with the Civil War in terms of Jefferson Davis. There's talk of trying Davis. He's almost tried, but it doesn't happen. And the closest we get here is thus the trial and execution of Henry Wirz. Wirz's defense, he has a number of defenses, but by far the most significant one, and really arguably the most valid, is this trial is going on by a military tribunal. Military tribunal, and it's happening in August and into September, and the execution won't happen until November. How can these things happen if the war is over? A military tribunal, a military execution, etc. A very good question. And the answer that the Judge Advocate General's office has to give is that the war is not over, that there is still a state of war or something like a war in effect. And so the trials themselves become a testing point, if you will, about whether the war continues.
Great, thank you. Moving along to the topic of Reconstruction, how do you think looking at the different ending points of the Civil War affects the way we discuss Reconstruction? And I'm especially interested in this because, your approach to the end of the Civil War reminds me a lot of the way many people approach Reconstruction, which is to think about, complicating that traditional endpoint of 1877 and to think about when did Reconstruction really end?
Right. And, it's before I even thought about writing this book, the whole question of when was Reconstruction was a live question, has been a live question really for as long as the word has existed probably, but remains very much a live question. When does Reconstruction begin? So that, typically we would say maybe 1863, that's when Eric Foner's, monumental book of Reconstruction begins. Well, its title has 1863 anyway, but why not 1860 when secession begins, right? Why not maybe 1861 Fort Sumter? Who knows? But my own reading is that Reconstruction begins really as soon as it's clear that the nation as it was cannot continue. And to me, that's 1860. Manisha Sinha's very important book that came out a couple of years ago that many of viewers will know, wrestles with this issue of the dates. I think she puts the beginning around 1860. She takes the end very far, right into the 20th century, and suggests that the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage is really the last of the Reconstruction amendments. So although she herself, I think, would acknowledge that Reconstruction is over by 1920, certainly probably by 1900. These are important questions about Reconstruction, and they matter. And so for that reason, I had to say in my note and language, what is it we're talking about when we use the word Reconstruction? Because Reconstruction is both a period and a not very clearly defined period, as you can tell from what I just said. But it is a period, and it's a period of putting the nation back together, but also the body politic back together, and not just back together, but reforming it, recreating a new nation, right? As Lincoln says at Gettysburg. And this body politic, of course, will include issues of freedom, equality for African Americans and others. And so that is a process as well as a period. And so as a process, the process is going on during the war. And for me, that's the key point, is that Reconstruction and the war overlap. To me, there can be no doubt about that. Because if you just look at wartime papers, 1863 beyond, you see the word Reconstruction appearing all the time. What is Reconstruction? Speeches on Reconstruction. So the Reconstruction begins during the war and is acknowledged to begin during the war. And it then gets wrapped up in the war, because if Reconstruction requires some element of force and the US Army, and I think it does, and this is a crucial argument in Greg Downes's book, After Appomattox, about occupation, that the Army is, an Army occupation is the essential, or at least one of the essential components of Reconstruction, then you have to talk about the war going beyond Appomattox and continuing into Reconstruction. However, I would argue that those are the use of war powers and not necessarily the war itself. That those aren't exactly the same thing. The Civil War is not perfectly aligned with the use of war powers. That's my definition. Others define it differently. Congress says that the war goes on until they give up war powers. That's 1871, and that's what Gregory Downes talks about in his great book, After Appomattox. But for me, the use of war powers continues beyond the actual Civil War of organized fighting and surrenders. And I do kind of locate the end of the war more into the 1867 range. I can say why if you wish, but I won't yet. But coming back to the issue of Reconstruction, it matters 1867. Why 1867? Because 1867 is when Congress passes the Reconstruction Act. That's an act it's been trying to create since 1863 and has yet to come for various reasons. Not until 1867, and events, the whole landscape has changed by 1867, does it finally come up with a comprehensive Reconstruction Act. And that act does all sorts of things, but it lays out a military scheme for the South. It really has, it's a whole different way of thinking about war powers and the war. And at the same time, Congress seizes the reins of war from the president, doing so with the Tenure of Office Act and then impeachment. It's controlling the war and other means too. So the nature of the war itself shifts for me in 1867. It's no longer a war with commander-in-chief. The terms of the war have shifted and war powers have shifted in significant ways.
Great, thank
And
you.
by the way, and then once I do that, then Reconstruction does absolutely continue into the 1870s. If you ask me when Reconstruction ends, I'm not going to give a better answer than anyone else because my book doesn't go there. I can give an answer, but it's not necessarily any better than any other person who's like me or you engaged in the teaching and discussion of the Civil War and Reconstruction. 1877 is the traditional end. I tend to end my course around then, but there's a really good argument for going well beyond 1877.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question to ask and think through with students. Now, I'm going to ask you about the other end of the Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War, and whether you could write a book about when the Civil War began. I've recently finished a book that'll be out, in a few months' time about Preston Brooks, and the caning of Sumner, and so that's been on my mind a little bit, thinking about events in Kansas and then, of course, in Congress. Whether you could realistically describe them as kind of a precursor to Civil War, I'm not sure. But what's your take on that when the Civil War began?
Right. And I would say asking of any war, when does it end, is a really interesting question. And of course, asking of any war, when does it begin, is a really interesting question. And we're much more used to discussing the beginning of the Civil War, mostly around causality. That is, why did the war begin, right? And we sort of assume the when, and we assume the when, and we usually look at the when as Fort Sumter. Maybe if you want to take more of a pro-Confederate side, you might say Lincoln calling up the troops after Fort Sumter, the argument being that just because the Confederates fired on this federal fort doesn't mean that war had to ensue. But once Lincoln called up the militia into the army, then it had to ensue. That's I would argue, a sort of a pro-Confederate argument, but a very much alive argument still. But then there's this other argument that you get at, which is, look, there's violence in Kansas and leading up to the war. There's people predicting the war. There's people writing about the war to come. Edmund Ruffin writing his novel about the war to come, that the Confederacy is going to win. And of course, violence, as you say, on the Senate floor in 1856 of the caning of Sumner. So these things really matter. And do they count, though, as the war, that is the Civil War? To me, I must admit some resistance. I do think they count absolutely. That again, we have to think about the United States as a very, in many ways, incoherent place in the 1850s or 1860s. And by that, I mean, it doesn't have the communication system we have today. And that's hugely important. Regional differences matter terrifically. So life on the ground in Kansas just isn't the same as life on the ground, like here where I am right now in Providence, Rhode Island. They're just fundamentally different. And the person who sits in Providence can't really know what's going on in Kansas. They can read the newspapers about bloody Kansas, but they don't know really if these are just isolated small events or if the whole state is on fire. And so it's very hard to know. It's quite jumbled, really. Um, these, so I would be a little resistant to the notion of a kind of coherent war that exists prior to certainly 1860. But even 1860 is a little challenging because the notion of a compromise, the notion that there could be compromise, is really quite alive in 1860, early 1861. I don't think compromise was possible. Now I can say that in hindsight. I don't believe compromise was possible. But at the time, of course, as you know, many people did. Um, Jay Winnick, who has this book that came out in 2001, April 1865, The Month That Saved America, is coming out next month with a book about Lincoln's Lost Peace, it's called, about the beginning of the war. So it's like we've reversed. He wrote this book right about the end of the war. Now he's going back to the beginning. I'm writing about that kind of challenges Winnick quite a bit, actually, to say April, the Union really wasn't saved in April, entirely at least. And so anyway, that's going to be an interesting book too, that sort of says, that he looks at the compromises very seriously as very serious things, but does concede in the end that Lincoln's moral stance against the spread of slavery was the deal breaker, and other, of course, abolitionists' stance on ending slavery everywhere was a deal breaker. So I am resistant to a beginning of the war that precedes April 1861. Um, Last story, and then I'll just very quickly. After Richmond falls, and Stanton, the Secretary of War, and others say, there may be a moment where we should have some kind of event that acknowledges the end of the war coming. Even if it hasn't come yet, we need to start thinking about what that event looks like. And so they start thinking about an event where they'll raise the US flag at Fort Sumter. And so there's this interesting correspondence between Stanton and a couple others about when did Fort Sumter fall? And so they are doing the research to try to figure out the exact day. What day do we call the true day that the war begins? Which is it the day that the firing begins on Fort Sumter? Is it the day that they surrender? Is it the day the Confederate flag goes up? So these kind of debates, they're even having them in 1865 to figure out what day, because they want a 4-year anniversary of whatever that day is. They want it to be on the exact 4-year anniversary, the raising of the U.S. flag at Sumter. So even then, this kind of interesting debates around what day do we mark.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think that they were having those conversations so long ago. One last question. We've talked a little bit about Lincoln's role in both starting the war and determining the way it ended. What about Andrew Johnson? How important was his role in ending the war? Did his leniency towards the South change things?
I think if Johnson had been a successful and well-liked president, he could have had a great effect. But of course, he ended up being quite unsuccessful and quite disliked just about by everybody. So it had his proclamation. I mean, the irony of this is tremendous, that the legal end date of the war is his proclamation. And yet he was the person whose authority was most questioned at the time. His leniency is, of course, now legendary. It's important to remember that when he comes into office, he sings a very aggressive tune about traitors will be punished and treason must be made odious. The radical Republicans, as they will be known, they think Andrew Johnson is their ally at first. So it takes months before his true nature is revealed, and I think revealed to himself. I don't think he realized quite just how lenient he was going to be and just how deeply he was going to be set against Black equality, even Black freedom. And so these things make Johnson crucial in the debate over when the war is over. But for Johnson, right, you might have had more agreement between the president and Congress and other parties to create something like a more coherent ending. But because by December of 1865, or certainly by April of 1866, Johnson is on full-on war with Congress. At that point, part of the issue of that conflict, the political conflict, a central part is the Civil War over? So it's a live issue. And so Johnson himself, by being who he is, by being in antagonism with Congress, even though he's trying to say the war is over, and he's treating the Southern whites as if the war is over, and it's almost as if the war never happened, um, he's kept the issue alive through his policies.
Yeah, that's really a fascinating piece of the story as well. And there are many more stories in the book that we weren't able to get to tonight. So many different layers to this important question of when the Civil War actually ended. I don't think we answered that completely tonight, but I don't think that was the point of the book either, to come up with a neat final solution to this question. But I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss it with us tonight. I also want to thank everyone else for attending, for taking time out of your evening to learn from Professor Vorenberg and these wonderful stories and insights into the end of the Civil War. Also want to thank donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies who make possible everything we do. I hope you'll keep an eye on our future events and join us at future webinars as well. So thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Paul.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, all.